The dust did not simply settle, it became a part of you, a fine, gritty powder that coated the throat and filled the lungs, tasting of sun-baked stone and despair. For 53 days, the siege engines had groaned, a constant, rhythmic counterpoint to the prayers and curses that rose from our lines. Now, on the 15th of July, in the year of our Lord 1099, the groaning had ceased, replaced by a roar that was not entirely human. It was the sound of a dam breaking, a flood of mail-clad faith and pent-up fury crashing against the last defenses of the holy city. I stood with my brother, Henri, on the shuddering fighting tower, the world narrowed to the span of a few treacherous planks. Below us, the world was fire and iron. Greek fire, that devilish concoction that water could not quench, streaked through the air, painting ghastly, greenish trails on the faces of dying men. Arrows whispered like malevolent insects. For the sepulchre, a knight bellowed, his voice cracking, and the cry was taken up, a wave of zeal that propelled us forward. Henry's eyes, so like our mother's, were wide not with fear, but with a terrifying fervor. He clutched the small, wooden cross she had pressed into his hand on the day we left our verdant fields in Normandy, a lifetime ago. We had buried that same earth under our fingernails to plant a new Frankish kingdom in this unforgiving soil, and the cost was written in the graves that dotted the road from here to Constantinople. My own faith felt less a shield and more a weight, heavy with the memory of the horrors we had endured to reach this moment, the starvation at Antioch, where we boiled leather for broth, the parched, bleached bones of the pilgrims who had marched before us, picked clean by vultures and the sun. I thought of the Saracen woman we encountered on the road, her quiet dignity as she offered a water skin to a dying boy, an act of mercy that now felt like a dream from another world. That world was gone, burned away by the relentless son of Outremer. Now, there was only the wall, the gate, and the city that held the center of all creation. Henri met my gaze, gave a sharp, wild nod, and then we were moving, scrambling over the ramparts and into the chaos of Jerusalem. The air changed, the scent of spices and ancient stone now laced with the coppery tang of blood. The roar was inside the city, and it had become something else entirely, not a cry of victory, but a scream of revelation and damnation, as the soldiers of Christ began their sacred butchery. The air in the Clermont field was thin and cold, biting at the lungs of the thousands who had gathered, a sea of expectant, grimy faces turned towards the raised platform where the Pope stood. He was not just a man that day, he was a vessel, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to press down upon the very soul of France. He spoke not of the petty squabbles and the bloody, internecine warfare that had turned Frank against Frank, brother against brother, draining the land of its strength. Instead, he painted a picture of a land beyond the sea, a place of fabled wonder and profound holiness now defiled. His words, carefully chosen and delivered with a fire that belied the chill, did not merely describe Jerusalem, they conjured it, the streets Christ had walked, now trod by unbelieving feet, the holy sepulchre, the very tomb of the Savior, now in the hands of a race he described as accursed, a vile and pagan people who desecrated altars and circumcised Christians in vile rituals. The message was a calculated thunderclap, a direct appeal to the martial pride of the knights in the crowd, shaming them for wasting their valor on meager local quarrels when a war of divine consequence awaited. He channeled their violence, giving it a holy purpose, a pilgrimage forged in steel. And then came the promise, the words that would echo for centuries, sealing the fate of millions, whoever for devotion alone, not to gain honor or money, goes to Jerusalem to liberate the Church of God can substitute this journey for all penance. It was the plenary indulgence, a remission of all sin, a guarantee of paradise not as a distant hope but as a reward for taking the cross. The cry did not build, it erupted, a raw, guttural roar of Deus Vult. God wills it, that tore from 1,000 throats at once, a wave of collective fervor so powerful it felt like a physical force. Men wept, shouted, and surged forward, their personal sins and worldly troubles suddenly rendered insignificant against the monumental, cleansing purpose he had offered them. They ripped their own cloaks to fashion crude crosses, their eyes alight with a terrifying blend of piety, ambition, and a hunger for redemption that would soon march east, leaving a trail of fire and blood in its wake. The fervor ignited by Urban's words did not cool into the disciplined march of armies but instead exploded into a chaotic, desperate exodus long before the nobles were ready. It was a frenzy born of a pure, uncomplicated faith, a fire stoked by men like Peter the Hermit, a skeletal figure whose fierce eyes and burning rhetoric seemed to channel the voice of God itself. He moved among the poor, the landless, the sinners weighed down by a lifetime of hardship, and he offered them not a complex military campaign but a simple, glorious path to salvation. He preached that the time for knights and kings was past, that God would favor the humble and the pure of heart, that the very stones of Jerusalem would tremble and fall before the faith of the true believers. This was a message that resonated not in the castle halls, but in the muddy villages and squalid alleys, and soon a vast, disorganized multitude began to move, a people's army armed with scythes, faith, and a desperate hope. Their first targets, however, were not the Saracens in the Holy Land, but the communities of Jews they encountered in the Rhineland, those they called the killers of Christ, living in their very midst. The logic of their twisted piety was inescapable. Why travel thousands of miles to fight the unbelievers when the enemies of the faith were here, their wealth a temptation and their very existence a blasphemy? The pogroms began in Speyer and worsened in Worms and Mainz, becoming a bloody prelude to the Crusade, where synagogues were burned, holy books desecrated, and whole communities were given the choice of the cross or the sword, many choosing martyrdom in a grim echo of the sacrifices to come. When this ragged host, plagued by hunger and its own internal strife, finally stumbled into the territories of the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia, the reality of their holy war descended upon them with brutal force. They were not met with crumbling walls but with the disciplined cavalry of Kilij Arslan, warriors who saw not soldiers of God but a disorderly mob of invaders. The battle was not a battle at all, it was a slaughter. The Turks encircled the desperate crusaders, their arrows darkening the sky, cutting down men, women, and children without distinction. The fields ran red, and those not killed outright were captured and sold into slavery across the east. The few survivors, including Peter himself, fled back to the west, their story a harrowing tale of divine punishment that foreshadowed the complex and bloody struggle between two worlds, a stark lesson in the terrible chasm that lay between zealous belief and the harsh, unyielding realities of war. The 8-month siege of Antioch was a descent into a particular kind of hell, a slow, grinding attrition that stripped the crusading army of its lofty ideals and reduced existence to a raw struggle for survival. The initial hope of a swift victory evaporated against the city's immense, seemingly impregnable walls, and the vast host found itself transformed from conquerors into trapped prisoners in the surrounding countryside. Their own hubris became a weapon against them as foraging parties, scouring the land bare, were systematically ambushed by Turkish cavalry, their heads often flung back over the ramparts as a grisly taunt. Hunger, a more patient and cruel enemy than any Saracen bowman, became the constant companion of knight and foot soldier alike. The proud warhorses, symbols of Frankish power, were the first to go, their meat becoming a costly and desperate commodity. Soon, stories whispered around starving campfires told of men boiling and eating leather from their shields and saddles, of digging for roots and rodents, and of the shadowy, unspeakable trade in the flesh of the dead. This physical decay was mirrored by a spiritual collapse, the certainty of God wills it curdled into a miasma of doubt and despair. Men deserted under cover of darkness, slipping away from an enterprise that felt increasingly like a collective death sentence. It was in this cauldron of utter hopelessness, with the army on the verge of dissolution and the threat of a massive relief force under Kerboga looming, that a miracle was needed not as an affirmation of faith, but as a simple, practical requirement to prevent total annihilation. The vision of a poor Provençal priest named Peter Bartholomew provided it. He claimed Saint Andrew had appeared to him, revealing the location of the Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced the side of Christ at Calvary, buried within the city's cathedral of St. Peter. Skeptical but desperate, the leaders, including a weary Bohemond of Taranto, permitted a dig in the designated spot. After a day of frantic excavation in the dark, damp earth, Peter himself leaped into the pit and produced a rusted iron point. To the starving, demoralized army, it was not a questionable relic, it was a tangible sign that God had not abandoned them. The discovery ignited a fire of renewed fanaticism, washing away the despair and replacing it with a furious, battle-hardened certainty. When Kerboga's army finally arrived and besieged the besiegers, the Crusaders, starving but spiritually intoxicated, did not cower behind their walls. They marched out, the holy lance carried before them as a standard, and in a desperate, almost suicidal engagement, they routed the astonished Turkish forces, a victory that seemed to defy all military logic and was attributed entirely to divine intervention, a moment where faith alone seemed to have moved a mountain. The final, frantic assault on the walls had lasted a day and a night, a continuous storm of ladders, siege towers, and a relentless battering at the gates, but when the breach finally came, it was not with a climactic clash of armies but with a sudden, terrifying collapse of order. The Frankish knights, fueled by a volatile mixture of zeal, bloodlust, and 3 years of unimaginable suffering, poured into the holy city not as liberators but as avenging angels, their souls scarred by the memories of starvation at Antioch and the bleached bones of their comrades lining the roads from Anatolia. The promise of salvation and the scent of plunder became one and the same in the choked, narrow streets. What followed was not a battle but a harvest, a systematic and merciless slaughter that spared neither man, woman, nor child. The chroniclers would later write of riders up to their knees in blood, of the screaming chaos so loud it drowned out prayer, of mosques and houses set ablaze with families trapped inside. The Jews of the city, who had fled to their main synagogue for refuge, were burned alive within its walls, a fiery tomb adding its black smoke to the pall hanging over Zion. The Muslim defenders who retreated to the Temple Mount, the very site of their Al-Aqsa Mosque, were methodically put to the sword, their bodies piled high in the sacred precincts until the marble courtyards ran slick with gore. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site in all Christendom, priests and knights wept with joy, singing hymns of praise and giving thanks for their deliverance even as the sounds of the massacre echoed just beyond its doors, the dissonance between the sacred goal and the profane means lost in the ecstasy of the moment. This was the culmination of the great pilgrimage, a victory stained so deeply in human suffering that the very stones of Jerusalem seemed to weep, the spiritual triumph forever haunted by the ghosts of that day, a foundational sin that would echo through the centuries and define the bitter, intractable nature of the conflict to come. The capture of Jerusalem, for all its blood-soaked glory, was not an end but a frantic beginning. The Crusaders, having achieved the seemingly impossible, now faced a more prosaic but equally daunting task: they had to learn how to rule. The vast majority of the army, their vows fulfilled, shed their pilgrim vows and embarked on the long journey home, leaving behind a skeletal force of a few hundred knights and a few thousand foot soldiers to hold a land surrounded by powerful, vengeful enemies. The first order of business was the election of a ruler, and in a move that revealed the nascent political tensions, the title of King of Jerusalem was offered to Godfrey of Bouillon, who refused a golden crown in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns, accepting instead the more humble title of Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. From this fragile seed, the Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli, sprang into being, a scattering of European feudal domains grafted with immense difficulty onto the ancient landscape of the Levant. Their survival was a precarious miracle, dependent on a constant trickle of new knights and pilgrims from the west and, more critically, on the profound disunity of their Muslim neighbors, who were fractured by rivalries between the Seljuks of Syria and the Fatimids of Egypt. To solidify their hold, the new lords embarked on a massive program of castle building, erecting formidable stone fortresses like Croc de Chevaliers, whose sheer walls and concentric defenses would become symbols of their tenuous power. Yet, these were not purely military colonies, they became a living, breathing, and deeply complex society. A new class emerged, the Polanes, the children of the original Crusaders born in the East, who often adopted local customs, wore silk robes, and engaged in a pragmatic, if tense, coexistence with their Muslim and Eastern Christian subjects. They traded with the very people they had come to fight, established bustling ports like Acre, and their courts became a strange fusion of European feudalism and Oriental opulence. This fragile, hybrid world, a splash of Frankish Europe in the heart of Islam, was always living on borrowed time, its existence a constant, armed vigil in a land that never truly accepted its new masters, a glittering, vulnerable outpost whose fate would be sealed the moment a leader arose strong enough to unite the Muslim world against it. The fragile kingdoms of Outremer, for decades sustained by the political fractures of the Muslim world, received their first great and terrible shock from the north. The county of Edessa, the earliest and most isolated of the Crusader states, stretched vulnerably into the Mesopotamian plains, a tempting prize for any rising power. That power manifested in the formidable figure of Imad ad-Din Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, a ruler whose ambition was matched only by his ruthlessness. He was a soldier of grim and singular purpose, seeing the expulsion of the Franks not merely as a political goal but as a sacred duty, and he recognized in Edessa the weakest link in the chain of Latin defenses. The city itself, with its mixed population of Armenians, Syrians, and Franks, was riven by internal distrust, its Frankish count, Jocelyn II, often absent and squabbling with his rival in Antioch. On a cold December night in 1144, while Jocelyn was away with much of his army, Zengi moved with swift and devastating precision. His forces surrounded the city, mining the walls and launching relentless assaults. Inside, the desperate defenders, led by the Latin Archbishop Hugh, and the Armenian population could only watch as their defenses crumbled. The siege was a brutal affair, culminating in a final, bloody storming of the breaches. Zengi's troops poured into the city, and a general massacre ensued, though he notably spared the native Christian population, a calculated move to divide the city's inhabitants and solidify his rule. The fall of Edessa sent a tremor through both the Levant and Christendom. For the Muslim world, it was a galvanizing victory, proof that the seemingly invincible Franj could be defeated, and it cemented Zengi's reputation as a champion of Islam. For the Crusader states, it was a catastrophe that exposed their fundamental vulnerability, proving they could not hold their territories indefinitely against a united and determined foe. In Europe, the news was met with shock and horror, a clarion call that shook the papacy from its complacency. The loss of the First Crusader state, a place whose very name echoed with the antiquity of Christendom, made it terrifyingly clear that the Holy Land was not won, but was being lost, a revelation that would soon compel a new pope, Eugenius III, to preach a second crusade, summoning the kings of Europe to a rescue mission for a dream that was already beginning to die. The fall of Edessa had sent a shockwave through the fractured Muslim world, but it was the rise of one man who would harness that energy into a unified and devastating force. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin, began not as a sultan but as a shrewd officer in the army of the Zengid dynasty, his Kurdish origins making him an outsider in a world of Turkish elites. His rise was a masterclass in political and military acumen, first establishing himself as the indispensable vizier of a fading Fatimid caliphate in Egypt, a position he used not to serve but to supplant, quietly dissolving the 2-century-old Shuraid dynasty and restoring Sunni orthodoxy in the name of his Zengid overlord, Nur al-Din. Upon Nur al-Din's death, Saladin did not mourn. He pounced, skillfully maneuvering to claim the Sultanate of Egypt for himself and then embarking on a decade-long campaign to absorb the Zengid territories of Syria and Mesopotamia, a patient, often ruthless consolidation of power under the banner of jihad. He was a complex and compelling nemesis, a man whose chivalry would become the stuff of legend in both East and West, his treatment of defeated foes, his sending of physicians to ailing enemies, his reputed generosity. Yet this was a courtesy extended only after absolute victory was assured. He understood the power of symbolism and piety, cultivating an image of austere devotion that stood in stark contrast to the perceived corruption and internal squabbling of the Frankish lords. He was, above all else, a unifier, the first leader since the coming of the Franks to weld the disparate and warring emirates of Syria, Egypt, and Jazira into a single, encircling empire. For the Crusader states, his rise was a slow-motion disaster, the gradual tightening of a noose they could see but seemed powerless to stop. The fragile network of truces and alliances that had allowed their survival for nearly a century was becoming obsolete, replaced by a single, implacable will dedicated to their eradication. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer facing a rival, it was facing a nation, and at its head was a commander of iron resolve and strategic brilliance, a man who would not rest until the black banner of the Abbasids flew once more over the holy city of Jerusalem. The catastrophe at Hattin was not a sudden disaster but a slow, agonizing march into a trap born of reckless pride and strategic folly. In the searing July heat of 1187, King Guy of Jerusalem, swayed by the aggressive faction of the court and the taunts of his own knights, made the fateful decision to abandon the vital springs at Sephuria and march his entire field army, some 20,000 men, including nearly every knight the kingdom could muster, across a waterless plateau to relieve the besieged fortress of Tiberias. Saladin, who had meticulously planned for this exact moment, allowed the Frankish host to bake and thirst under the relentless sun, his skirmishers harrying their flanks and sealing off any retreat to the life-giving water. By the time the desperate crusaders caught sight of the glittering waters of Lake Tiberias, they were surrounded, their morale shattered by a night of terror where Saladin's men set fire to the dry brush, filling the air with smoke and the sounds of prayers and war chants from the Muslim lines. The final battle the next morning was less a fight than a slaughter. The Frankish infantry, mad with thirst, broke and fled towards the hills of the Horns of Hattin, only to be cut down or captured. The corps of knights, the Ironheart of Outremer, made their last stand on the rocky slopes, but without water and surrounded, their famed charge was futile. King Guy's royal tent was cut down around him, and he was captured along with a host of the kingdom's greatest barons. But the most profound spiritual loss was the capture of the true cross, the kingdom's most sacred relic, which was paraded upside down on a spear point in a gesture of ultimate humiliation before being sent to Damascus. Saladin's victory was so complete it was apocalyptic. The entire fighting strength of the kingdom of Jerusalem was annihilated in a single day, its king a prisoner, its holy relic lost, and its cities now lay utterly defenseless, their garrisons empty and their walls waiting for the conqueror who was already on the march. The capture of Jerusalem by Saladin in 1187 was a conquest of a profoundly different character than the bloody sack of 1099, a fact that did little to lessen the searing spiritual devastation felt throughout Christendom. In the weeks following his annihilating victory at Hattin, Saladin's armies had swept through the Crusader kingdom with methodical efficiency, and one by one the cities, now denuded of their defenders, capitulated until only the holy city itself remained. Within its walls, a desperate and leaderless population, swelled by refugees from the fallen coastal towns, prepared for a martyr's last stand, knowing the fate their own forefathers had inflicted upon the Muslim inhabitants. But Balian of Ibelin, a baron who had escaped Hattin and now found himself the reluctant commander of a city on the brink of annihilation, negotiated not with weapons, but with grim pragmatism. He famously threatened to destroy the Muslim holy sites within the Dome of the Rock and slaughter the thousands of Muslim prisoners within the city, then fight to the last man, a chilling bluff that Saladin, the chivalrous sultan, took seriously. The resulting terms of surrender were a study in stark contrast to the Frankish entry nearly a century prior. There would be no massacre, no streets running with blood. Instead, a ransom was set for each soul, 10 gold dinars for a man, 5 for a woman, and 1 for a child. Those who could pay were granted safe passage, those who could not, some 15,000 of the city's poorest, were condemned to slavery. For 40 days, a solemn procession of the defeated filed out of the gates of Jerusalem, a river of human sorrow flowing towards the Christian ports of Tyre and Tripoli, their weeping a stark counterpoint to the triumphant calls to prayer now rising from the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was richly cleansed with rose water and restored to Islamic worship. The true cross, that potent symbol of Frankish divine favor, was gone, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was closed to Latin worship, its bells silenced. The fall of the city sent a tremor through Europe, a loss so profound it felt like a tear in the fabric of the universe, a divine judgment that would galvanize the Third Crusade and etch the name of Saladin into the Western mind not merely as a conqueror, but as a figure of formidable and terrifying nobility. The Third Crusade was Christendom's titanic, star-crossed response to the calamity of Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem, a colossal enterprise that marshaled the combined might of its 3 most powerful monarchs yet was fated to be remembered for what it failed to reclaim. Frederick Barbarossa, the legendary Holy Roman Emperor, led a vast German army overland, a seemingly unstoppable force whose discipline and numbers promised to shake the very foundations of Saladin's empire, only for the aged emperor to drown in a petty Anatolian river, his death scattering his leaderless host and severing the campaign's vital northern prong before it even reached the Holy Land. This left the stage to the two rival kings, Philip Augustus of France and Richard the Lionheart of England, whose mutual loathing festered in the siege lines of Acre, a grueling 2-year investment that finally broke the city's defenses but also exposed the deep fractures in the Christian cause. Philip, a master of cold political calculation, saw little glory in a long, costly war in the East and, after the fall of Acre, seized upon a pretext of illness to return to France, where he immediately began scheming to seize Richard's continental lands. This left Richard alone, a peerless warrior and brilliant tactician but now bearing the entire weight of the Crusade on his shoulders. His subsequent campaign down the coast to Jaffa was a masterpiece of military logistics and aggressive generalship, his disciplined march in the face of constant harrying attacks a testament to his skill, culminating in the stunning victory at Arsuf where his well-timed cavalry charge shattered Saladin's army in the field. Yet, for all his martial prowess, the ultimate prize, Jerusalem, remained frustratingly out of reach. Twice he brought his army within sight of the holy city's walls, close enough for his men to smell the air of Zion, but each time he made the agonizing, pragmatic decision to withdraw, knowing that even if he stormed the city, his fractured army lacked the numbers to hold it against the forces Saladin could still rally and his own lines of communication back to the sea would be severed. The crusade ended not with a triumphant entry but with a tense truce, the Treaty of Jaffa, which secured a narrow coastal strip for the Crusader kingdom and guaranteed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem, a meager consolation for an effort that had consumed the treasures and passions of nations. Richard, after narrowly surviving his journey home, would never see the Holy Land again, his legendary campaign a magnificent, flawed, and ultimately incomplete symphony of war, a clash of titans that left Saladin in possession of the city that was the heart of the entire conflict. The fall of Acre after a grueling 2-year siege was meant to be the glorious restart of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but it instead became the stage for one of the Crusade's most chilling acts of cold-blooded pragmatism. The complex terms of the city's surrender had stipulated a ransom for the Muslim garrison and the return of the true cross, but as the weeks dragged on after the victory, Saladin delayed fulfilling his end of the agreement. For Richard the Lionheart, time was a resource he could not afford to squander. His rival, Philip Augustus, had already departed for Europe, and the entire campaign's momentum was stalling. The presence of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners within the captured city was an immense liability, consuming precious food and requiring a large guard detail that weakened his field army as he prepared to march south against Saladin's main force. On a hot August morning, with Saladin's army watching from a distance, Richard made a decision that would stain his chivalric reputation forever. He ordered the entire Muslim garrison, bound and helpless, marched out onto the plains before the ruins of Acre. There, before the horrified eyes of Saladin's advance guard, his soldiers systematically began to behead them. For 2 days the slaughter continued, the fields turning into a charnel house as some 2,700 men were executed, a few spared only for their high rank or potential value. It was not an act of blind rage but a calculated message of terror and resolve, a brutal demonstration meant to shatter Muslim morale and prove that Richard would not be bound by the conventions of war. The act succeeded in its immediate, tactical goal, clearing his army to march and demonstrating a terrifying willingness to escalate, but its strategic cost was catastrophic. It extinguished any possibility of a swift negotiated peace and poured fuel on the fires of religious hatred, hardening Muslim resolve for generations. Saladin, in grim retaliation, would from that point forward execute every Frankish prisoner he took, deepening a cycle of atrocity and revenge that ensured the Third Crusade, and all the conflicts that followed, would be fought with a new and unforgiving savagery, forever burying any lingering pretense of chivalric conflict between cross and crescent beneath the sands of Palestine. The Fourth Crusade stands as one of history's most profound and tragic perversions of intent, a venture that began with the aim of striking at the heart of Islam in Egypt but instead devolved into a sordid saga of Venetian greed and Latin vengeance that would irrevocably fracture Christendom. The entire enterprise became fatally entangled in a web of debt from its inception, as the Crusaders, unable to raise the sum promised to the Doge, Enrico Dandolo, found themselves forced to work off their obligation by doing Venice's bidding. This began with the shocking sack of the Christian port of Zara on the Dalmatian coast, an act of such blatant piracy that it prompted Pope Innocent III to excommunicate the entire crusading army, a sentence he would later lift in desperate hope they might still reach the Holy Land. It was from this muddled state of sin and financial servitude that the young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, saw his opportunity, arriving with lavish promises to pay the Crusaders' entire debt, fund their expedition, and place the Byzantine army at their service if they would only first sail to Constantinople and restore his deposed father to the throne. The temptation was irresistible, and the crusade was rerouted, becoming a mercenary force in a dynastic struggle. When they achieved their initial goal and placed Alexios IV on the throne, only to find the bankrupt imperial treasury could not possibly fulfill his extravagant pledges, the mood within the Crusader camp turned from avarice to bitter resentment. The situation exploded when a popular uprising in Constantinople overthrew and murdered Alexios, placing a fiercely anti-Latin emperor on the throne who openly scorned the Westerners camped at his walls. Seeing their treaty broken and their rewards vanished, the Crusaders resolved to take their payment by force. In April 1204, they unleashed a 3-day onslaught upon the greatest city in the Christian world, an orgy of destruction that dwarfed any sack of a Muslim city. Ancient churches, including the magnificent Hagia Sophia, were desecrated, their holy relics looted and their golden mosaics pried from the walls. Palaces and libraries, repositories of a millennium of classical knowledge, were put to the torch. Nuns were violated in their convents, and civilians were slaughtered in the streets. The empire was carved up into feudal fiefdoms, and the vast wealth of Constantinople was shipped back to adorn the cathedrals and squares of the West. The Fourth Crusade never came within 1,000 miles of Jerusalem. It succeeded only in destroying the Byzantine Empire as a major power, creating a legacy of hatred between Eastern and Western Christianity that persists to this day and ensuring that any future hope of a united Christian front against Islam was lost forever. In the year 1212, as kings and popes planned new military expeditions, a different, more troubling kind of fervor took root in the hearts of the common people, a collective despair over the failure of their mighty lords to reclaim Jerusalem, giving rise to a desperate and tragic belief that divine power would favor the pure and innocent where armored might had failed. The movement began not in castle halls but in fields and villages, sparked by the preaching of a young French shepherd boy, Stephen of Cloyes, who claimed to bear a letter from Christ himself, commanding him to lead a peaceful crusade of children to the Holy Land. A similar fervor erupted in Germany around the figure of Nicholas, a boy from Cologne. The idea, born of a literal and heartbreaking faith, was that the Mediterranean Sea would part before them as the Red Sea had for Moses, allowing them to walk dry-shod to Jerusalem, and that through their innocence, the Saracens would be converted, not conquered. This was an army not of swords and siege engines, but of psalms and simple belief. From across France and the Rhineland, thousands of children, along with adolescents, poor peasants, and a scattering of priests, abandoned their plows and their homes, forming ragged processions that marched south, singing and following their youthful messiahs who carried makeshift crosses. They faced not Turkish arrows but the harsh realities of the journey itself. Hunger and exhaustion thinned their ranks, and many perished on the long trek through the Alps. Those who reached the Italian port cities of Genoa and Brindisi were met not with a miraculous parting of the waves but with the vast, unyielding expanse of the sea. The myth that they were all sold into slavery is an oversimplification, but the reality was scarcely less cruel. Some were given free passage back home, a handful may have settled in Italy, but many fell prey to unscrupulous merchants and mariners. Chroniclers record that 7 ships filled with young crusaders from Marseilles were indeed betrayed, 2 were lost in a storm, and the other 5 were sailed to the slave markets of North Africa and Egypt, where their young lives were ended in servitude, their purity and faith exploited as just another commodity in the brutal economy of the medieval world. The Children's Crusade left no mark on the map of the Holy Land, but it left a deep scar on the soul of Europe, a poignant and terrible testament to the explosive, and often devastating, power of naive faith when all other hope has been extinguished. The Ayyubid dynasty founded by Saladin, for all its power, eventually succumbed to the same internal rivalries that had once plagued the Muslim world, but from its weakening structure emerged a new, far more ruthless and disciplined military force that would ultimately prove to be the deadliest foe the Crusader states ever faced. The Mamluks, meaning the owned, were a caste of slave soldiers, predominantly Kipchak Turks from the Eurasian steppes, purchased as boys, converted to Islam, and raised from childhood with no loyalty except to their master and their own corps, their entire existence dedicated to the art of war. They were the ultimate military professionals, living weapons forged in the barracks of Cairo, and they viewed the freeborn Arab and Kurdish emirs of the Ayyubid court with a mixture of contempt and ambition. Their path to power was paved in blood when the Ayyubid Sultan As-Salih Ayyub died suddenly while facing the threat of Louis IX's crusade at Damietta. In a desperate and unprecedented move, his widow, the formidable Shajar al-Dur, in alliance with the top Mamluk generals, concealed his death and orchestrated the defense of Egypt, a maneuver that shattered the old order. The subsequent political vacuum led to a brutal power struggle, culminating in the Mamluk overthrow of the Ayyubid heir and the assassination of the new Sultan, Turan Shah, by his own bodyguard of Mamluks, the Bariya, in a bloody coup that established their first Sultan, Aybak. This was not merely a change of ruler but a revolution in military and political culture, replacing a dynastic monarchy with a meritocracy of the sword where the most powerful and cunning emir could seize the throne. The Mamluks were not interested in the chivalric truces and nuanced diplomacy that had sometimes characterized Ayyubid relations with the Franks. Their legitimacy was rooted in their identity as the unyielding defenders of Islam, and they pursued a policy of relentless, total war. They were masters of combined arms warfare, their skills as cavalry archers honed on the steppes combined with sophisticated siege tactics, and they were united by a fierce esprit de corps and a burning desire to prove themselves the true heirs of Saladin's jihad. For the increasingly isolated and divided Crusader enclaves clinging to the Levantine coast, the rise of the Mamluk Sultanate signaled the end of an era of precarious coexistence and the beginning of a final, inexorable confrontation with an enemy for whom compromise was not an option and surrender was not a consideration. The Fifth Crusade, conceived as a bold masterstroke to break the power of the Ayyubids by striking at their wealthy Egyptian heartland, became a grueling lesson in the harsh realities of war in the Nile Delta. The Great Army, bearing the blessing of Pope Innocent III and led by the papal legate Pelagius, had chosen its target wisely, the heavily fortified port city of Damietta, which sat astride the main branch of the Nile and was the key to all of Egypt. The siege, however, quickly bogged down into a nightmare of stagnant water, disease, and frustration. The Crusaders established their camp on the swampy ground between the river and the sea, where the summer heat bred pestilence and the Nile's annual flood turned their positions into a morass of mud and misery. For months, they were pinned down, suffering far more from dysentery and fever than from Muslim arrows, their numbers dwindling in the suffocating humidity as they stared at Damietta's formidable walls and the great chain that blocked the river. It was during this stalemate, with morale at its lowest ebb, that a figure of radical peace emerged from the heart of the martial enterprise. Francis of Assisi, the humble preacher who had founded an order based on poverty and devotion, had traveled to the Crusader camp not to fight, but to preach. Believing that the conversion of souls was a greater victory than the conquest of land, he undertook an act of breathtaking audacity. With a companion, he walked unarmed and unprotected through the battle lines and into the camp of the Ayyubid Sultan, Al-Kamil. He was not immediately killed, but was brought before the Sultan, where he preached the gospel of Christ, challenging the Sultan's imams to a trial by fire to prove the truth of his faith. While Al-Kamil, a thoughtful and pragmatic ruler, was impressed by the little poor man's sincerity and courage and treated him with courtesy, he ultimately rejected his message, though he allowed Francis to return unharmed to the Christian lines. The saint's gambit had failed to bring peace, but it stood as a stark, luminous counterpoint to the violence and squalor of the siege, a fleeting moment where the possibility of a different kind of encounter between cross and crescent flickered briefly before being extinguished by the relentless logic of war. A logic that would soon see Damietta fall to the Crusaders not through miraculous conversion, but through the grim, grinding work of starvation and assault. The failure of Francis of Assisi's peaceful mission to Sultan al-Kamil did not break the siege's grim deadlock, but it did cast the brutal military endeavor in a stark and unsettling new light, highlighting a path not taken. The saint's return to the Crusader camp, unharmed but unsuccessful, was a quiet event that stood in dramatic contrast to the clamor of siege engines and the groans of the dying. He brought no truce, no mass conversion, only the silent testimony of his own unwavering faith and the bewildering fact of his survival. For the soldiers and knights, mired in the swampy filth and the relentless attrition of disease, his story of being received with curiosity and respect by the Muslim ruler was a disorienting tale. It suggested an enemy capable of intellectual engagement and chivalrous treatment, a far cry from the demonic infidel portrayed in crusading rhetoric. This encounter, though a footnote in the military chronicles, exposed the profound ideological rift at the heart of the crusading movement itself. Here was the living embodiment of the Church's evangelical mission, attempting to win souls through love and example, standing amidst an army whose stated purpose was to reclaim holy ground through blood and steel. The two methods, the peaceful word and the violent sword, could not coexist, one inherently judged the other. Francis's presence was a silent rebuke, a fleeting glimpse of an alternative reality where faith was a bridge rather than a battle standard. Yet, in the pragmatic world of the Crusade, his failure only reinforced the conviction of the legate Pelagius and the war party that force was the only language their enemy understood. The saint's gambit faded quickly from the immediate concerns of the camp, overshadowed by the pressing issues of supply lines, the next assault, and the ever-present stench of death. He would soon depart, leaving the army to its fate, his mission a beautiful, failed experiment that lingered only as a haunting question mark over the entire enterprise, a moment of pure, unarmed courage that highlighted the tragic chasm between the spiritual ideals of Christianity and the brutal political realities of the Crusades. The Sixth Crusade stands as one of the most bizarre and paradoxical chapters in the entire history of the conflict, a campaign that succeeded through diplomatic cunning and the threat of force while its leader was excommunicated and utterly at odds with the papacy. Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, a man of profound intellect and deep skepticism, who spoke Arabic and was more fascinated by Islamic science and philosophy than by papal decrees, had long delayed his vowed crusade, earning him the bitter enmity of Pope Gregory IX, who finally excommunicated him for his failure to depart. Frederick sailed for the East in 1228 anyway, an excommunicate leading a holy war, a situation that bewildered both his followers and his foes. Upon arrival, he found the Ayyubid realm fractured by internal power struggles following the death of his sometime ally, Sultan al-Kamil. The Sultan, preoccupied with a rebellion by his own family in Syria, had no desire for a costly war with the formidable, if theologically suspect, Holy Roman Emperor. What followed was not a series of glorious battles but a masterclass in realpolitik negotiation. Frederick, leveraging his deep understanding of the Muslim world and al-Kamil's pressing need for a peaceful settlement on his flank, engaged in a prolonged and sophisticated parley. The resulting Treaty of Jaffa in 1229 was a stunning diplomatic coup. Without a single major engagement, Frederick secured the peaceful transfer of Jerusalem, along with Bethlehem and a corridor to the sea, back into Christian hands for a period of 10 years. The city's Muslim inhabitants retained control of their holy sites on the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, and freedom of worship was guaranteed for both faiths. But when Frederick II entered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there were no cheering crowds or chanting priests. The city lay under an interdict placed by the Patriarch of Jerusalem, who saw the emperor's deal with the infidel as an abomination. To the Christian nobles of Outremer and the military orders, the victory felt hollow, achieved not by divine favor but by a cynical pact with a Muslim ruler, and tainted by the papal excommunication that hung over their emperor like a shroud. He crowned himself king of Jerusalem in an empty church, a triumphant heretic who had achieved through shrewd statecraft what the blood of countless devout crusaders had failed to win for a century, a victory that pleased no one and exposed the deepening chasm between the spiritual ideal of the crusade and the complex, pragmatic realities of power in the Levant. The 10-year truce that had returned Jerusalem to Christian hands through Frederick II's diplomacy was always a fragile thing, a temporary cessation of hostilities that satisfied neither the deep-seated religious passions of the Muslim populace nor the expansionist ambitions of new powers rising in the region. The city's defenses were weak, its Christian population small, and its symbolic value made it a perpetual target. The end came not from the Ayyubids with whom Frederick had treated, but from a wild and destructive force that even the Ayyubids could not control, a rampaging army of Khwarezmian Turks, displaced from their Central Asian homelands by the Mongol onslaught. These were masterless marauders, fierce Turkish horsemen who had been hired as mercenaries by the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt, al-Salih Ayyub, in his own internecine wars against his Syrian relatives, but they operated with a terrifying autonomy. In the summer of 1244, this horde, numbering in the thousands, swept down upon a nearly defenseless Jerusalem. They met little resistance. What followed was a sack that horrifically echoed the bloodshed of 1099, but this time the victims were the city's Christian inhabitants. The Khwarezmians showed no interest in negotiation or ransom. They desecrated the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, digging up the bones of the Latin kings of Jerusalem and burning them, and they massacred the Christian population with a savagery that shocked even the seasoned observers of the age. Those who were not killed were taken as slaves. The city was left a smoldering ruin, its Christian presence all but extinguished. The subsequent, desperate attempt by a combined army of knights from the Kingdom of Jerusalem and their unlikely allies, the Ayyubid emirs of Damascus and Homs, to confront the Khwarezmian-Egyptian coalition at the Battle of La Fourbi ended in a catastrophic defeat that dwarfed even Hattin in its totality, shattering the last remaining field army of the Crusader kingdom. The fall of Jerusalem in 1244 was final. It was not a temporary setback to be reversed by another treaty or a future crusade. It was the permanent end of the Christian political project in the Holy City. The dream of a secure Latin Jerusalem, which had flickered back into a tenuous existence through Frederick's deal, was now snuffed out forever, and the kingdom was reduced to a handful of fortified coastal cities, waiting for the final, inevitable blow from a newly unified and powerful Egyptian sultanate that would now be ruled by the Mamluks. The final, agonizing act of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land was not a sudden collapse but a slow, grinding siege that compressed the entire two-century epic into one last, defiant stand. Acre, the glittering capital of this rump kingdom, the gateway to the west and the last great city of the Franks in Outremer, became the focus of the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil's overwhelming force in the spring of 1291. His army was a testament to the military machine the Mamluks had perfected, a seemingly endless host of warriors, supported by nearly 100 massive siege engines that hurled stones and Greek fire day and night against the city's famed double walls, a bombardment so relentless it was said to shake the very earth. Inside, a desperate and outnumbered garrison, a fragile coalition of Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, Venetian and Pisan mariners, and every able-bodied man who could hold a weapon, fought with the grim knowledge that there was no retreat, no kingdom left to fall back upon. For 6 weeks, they held, repelling direct assaults with a ferocity born of absolute desperation, the streets running with blood and the air thick with smoke and the screams of the wounded. But the weight of the Mamluk numbers and their professional sappers, who undermined the towers and walls, was irresistible. The end came when the great accursed tower, the bulwark of the inner wall, was breached. The Mamluks poured into the city, and the defense shattered into 1,000 pockets of horrific, close-quarter fighting in the narrow, smoke-choked alleys. Knights made their last stands on the church steps, merchants and their families drowned in the harbor trying to reach any ship that would take them, and the last king of Jerusalem, Henry II, was evacuated to the relative safety of a Venetian galley, forced to watch as his kingdom was consumed by fire and sword. The final survivors, a mass of terrified civilians and soldiers, crowded onto the quays, only to be slaughtered as the walls collapsed upon them. The Templar fortress, a final redoubt, held out for days after the main city fell, its defenders dying to the last man when the structure was deliberately undermined, collapsing in a great cloud of dust and rubble. The Fall of Acre extinguished not just a city but an idea. The surviving coastal towns of Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut were abandoned without a fight. The last ship sailed for Cyprus, carrying a broken people and the ghosts of a lost world, leaving the Syrian coast to the victors, its castles and churches silent, its Frankish name forgotten. The great crusading experiment ended not with a treaty, but with a final, cataclysmic roar of falling stone and the silent, empty sea. The retreat to Cyprus was not a strategic withdrawal but a funeral procession across the water, the ships laden not with treasure but with the ghosts of a lost world and the shattered remnants of its people. The great crusading enterprise, born in a fire of pious fervor at Clermont, expired not with a bang but with the silent, hollow echo of the last sail disappearing over the western horizon, leaving the Levantine coast to the kites and the Mamluk garrison troops. In the decades and centuries that followed, the memory of Outremer curdled in the West into a potent mixture of myth and bitter regret, a lost golden age of chivalry that fueled futile new plans for crusades that would never sail and a deep-seated resentment towards the East that would poison relations between Christendom and Islam for a millennium. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, found new purpose and new enemies, their immense wealth and power making them targets for jealous kings, while their galleys continued a perpetual, smaller war against Muslim shipping from new bases on Rhodes and Malta. The legacy for the world left behind was even more profound. The constant state of conflict had hardened religious boundaries, extinguishing the more tolerant, fluid interactions that had sometimes existed and cementing a mutual demonization that became a permanent feature of the geopolitical landscape. The commercial arteries forged by the Italian merchant states, however, proved more durable than the kingdoms they served, and the flow of goods, knowledge, and disease between East and West intensified, helping to fuel the rise of Europe's merchant class and the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance. But this was a cold consolation for the human cost, for the millions of lives lost on both sides, for the generations of Polanes who had called that land home and were now forever exiled, and for the deep, unhealed wound left in Jerusalem, a city that had been fought over with a unique and terrible passion. The Crusades left behind a world more interconnected yet more deeply divided, having demonstrated the explosive power of fused religious and military zeal, a lesson that would be learned and relearned in countless other conflicts, their shadow stretching long across history, a tangled inheritance of glory, fanaticism, failure, and a sorrow as deep and as enduring as the sea that finally swallowed the last of the Crusader kings. Help me reach 7,000 subscribers. Please like the video and share your thoughts in the comments.